over time, I gradually started to realize that this was totally nuts. And this was not at all what the human brain was doing. And so really, the brain is a giant action initiation and conflict resolution mechanism. Literature is there to convince you of various deep truths. And it basically all just comes down to making new plans and then picking the right plan for you in the moment. Logic is a wonderful tool for analyzing certain situations, but it is not the same as reality. But every big revolution starts as an anomaly.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. And joining us today is Angus Fletcher, Professor of Story Science at Ohio State's Project Narrative, which describes itself as the world's leading academic think tank for the study of how stories work. Just the kind of thing we love here at the Data Malarkey podcast. Now, Angus started his academic career in the neurophysiology lab of the University of Michigan's medical school, convinced that the human brain worked like a computer, crunching data inputs from the outside world into conclusions that drove behavior. But the more he researched and the more he read, the more he found this wasn't the case. Rather than being primarily data-driven and logical, Angus now sees the brain as emotional, creative, and powered by story. So from studying action potentials under the microscope, Angus flipped disciplines to study how emotion, creativity, and story work in the brain. He quit neurophysiology for a PhD in English literature at Yale. And a character who has loomed particularly large then and ever since is Shakespeare, as perhaps the world's finest storyteller. As a classicist by my first training, before heading in the other direction towards psychology, I'm particularly thrilled that Angus also has a penchant for the greats of Greek literature, from Aristophanes to Sappho. Angus' approach and manifesto is well summarized in his 2025 book, Primal Intelligence, which sets out his philosophy and training, where he's had great success, perhaps counterintuitively, with the military. He says humans have 4 primal powers: intuition, imagination, emotion, and common sense, all of which can act smart even with little information. Narrative cognition, he maintains, works in human brains, but always will be impossible for AI. I know we're in for a fantastic ride in our conversation today, given previous guests and my passion for blending the emotional and the rational in data storytelling. It's great to have you with us, Angus. Welcome to Data Malarkey.
I mean, it's a huge pleasure to be here, Sam. Thank you for that brilliant introduction.
Well, first off, can you tell me if that is a good narrative of how you've got to where you are today? Is there anything I've missed out or got wrong? This is your chance to put the record straight.
No, I think that was extraordinary. And in fact, I'm starting to suspect that maybe the best way to handle this podcast is for you to answer for me, because it seems that you have a clearer and more precise grasp of exactly what I'm doing than I do.
Well, I have to say, I mean, you've made it very easy for me in the trail that you've left in your departmental and your book websites. But thank you very much for that. I'm glad that I at least I got that bit of it right. Now, before we get down and dirty with data, or indeed maybe the irrelevance of data, I wanted to start with a question that's designed to get to the heart of what makes you you. And it doesn't necessarily ask you to tell us about the day job. So tell me, Angus, if you would, how do you spend your time?
Well, to be totally honest, I spend most of my time at the moment hanging out with U.S. Army special operators. And then the time I'm not hanging out with U.S. special operators, I'm hanging out with my kids. So that's basically 95% of my time.
We will come back to U.S. Army special operators. I'm absolutely gripped and fascinated by the tales that you tell in your book and elsewhere. But let's go back, if we could, before we get onto the training and development in the military, if we can, to your major career pivot. Can you tell us what it was that made you first question your work in the neurophysiology lab, and why and how those doubts took you to Yale for your PhD in English literature?
Yeah, so I began working in neurophysiology, which is a branch of neuroscience, as a young person, and really loved it. And I spent many, many years working in a specific lab, which was a brilliant experience for me, where we essentially did a form of what is vivisection. And so hopefully this won't be too grim for your audience, but basically we would decapitate rats, we would take out their living neurons, and we would study how those neurons worked. And largely we were operating on this model of cognition, which I'm sure will be familiar to a lot of your audience because it was and remains the dominant model of cognition, and it's computational. And basically what we were thinking is that different neurons were passing packets of information back and forth to each other. We thought a lot of the time of those neurons as being operating sort of like transistors, like they were on or they were off, or maybe they were working in various Bayesian networks or something like that, But basically they were thinking on some kind of statistical way. And the brain as a whole was a giant information processor. It was an information system. Its job was to take in all of this data, crunch it, use it to make predictions, probabilistic predictions. And when those predictions weren't correct, to revise them. And so, that's what I thought my first couple of years working in the lab. And then over time, I gradually started to realize that this was totally nuts. And this was not at all what the human brain was doing. A small part of the human brain does this. Parts of the brain that are associated with vision do this. But most of the brain is not at all interested in large amounts of data processing. It's not interested in algorithmic processes. It's not interested in predicting. It's not interested in math at all. And sort of the reason you know this is because most biology, so if you go out and you study living animals in the wild, what most biology will tell you, most modern biologists will tell you, is that life proceeds through the invention of new behaviors. And this is something we've known since the 19th century in Darwin. And basically, war is a kind of battle for survival. And the way you win is you innovate. You come up with a new way of acting. And maybe that new way of acting allows you to get up the tree faster and eat the banana before the other banana eaters are there. Maybe that new way of acting allows you to evade the tiger that's trying to hunt you. But there's this huge premium on the innovation of action. And so really what most intelligence is innovating action. It's coming up with new actions that break and frustrate old patterns. And when you realize this and you look at how neurons work, you realize actually the fundamental purpose of a neuron is not to process information. A neuron on its own will very happily act without any input at all. It will just sit there acting. It will initiate action. And when you do a whole bunch of neurons together, they'll all start to initiate action together, sort of a little bit like a democratic community. If you've ever been around those, people will just spontaneously have thoughts and they'll suggest them to other people. If you've been in a family, everyone in a family has an opinion about what you should do that day on your vacation or whatever. And then there'll start to be tension and conflict and you'll have to navigate that conflict and so on and so on. And so really the brain is a giant action initiation and conflict resolution mechanism. And the purpose of initiating all those actions is over time to create new chains of actions. A new chain of actions, that's a new, sequence of behaviors would be one way of thinking about it. But another way of thinking about it would be that it's a narrative or a plan. And so really your brain exists to come up with new plans, new sequences of actions, new stories that it then acts out and tries and tests and experiments in the real world. And there's no information on whether those plans are going to work or not. You just have to try them and see if they do. And if they don't work, you come up with a new plan and you try that. And so that was when working, to give you a very long answer to this question, that was when working in that lab, I started to realize, actually, the human brain is not really a computer. It's actually much more like a child. A child, if you leave them alone, will just start to become restless and will start to do things and try things and get into trouble. And that's really kind of how the brain works naturally. And so I wanted to understand, why is that intelligent? How is that intelligent? What are the origins of that? And how do we kind of make human behavior more intelligent? Because obviously, if all it's doing is just initiating random plans all the time, it can get into a lot of trouble. Is there a way to kind of refine that and grow that over time? And that was when I shifted to Shakespeare. And the reason I shifted to Shakespeare is because Shakespeare is a master of inventing new stories. New stories are new plots are new plans. And so I thought to myself, if I could understand how Shakespeare's brain was so imaginative, so creative, but also so effective because it came up with new stories that worked, if I could understand that, then I could understand maybe a little bit how to shape and refine human intelligence.
Brilliant! What a fascinating journey. Now, was it difficult? And once you'd made that, you'd drawn that conclusion, and you decided to make that leap. Was it difficult shifting from hard science to English literature? And maybe I'm not just interested in the reaction of professors, but what did your professors and doctoral supervisors think of your approach?
Well, everybody thought I was totally nuts, and they thought I was nuts on both sides. First of all, all of my mentors in science thought this was bonkers, and they thought that I would go and study English literature for a couple of years and then give up and come back because they just thought it would just be obvious to me that this was a ludicrous idea. And meanwhile, when I got to Yale, everyone there thought I was a Philistine and a barbarian. I had all these sort of ideas that they considered horrifying. So, for example, the reason I decided I wanted to study Shakespeare is because I was like, Shakespeare was an earlier writer. So his writing must be simpler than later writers. And so in the same way that you would want to study an earlier life form because it's simpler, and there's less complexity going on there, I'll study Shakespeare. And of course, the moment I said this to my Shakespeare professor, he immediately basically threw me out of the classroom. He was like, no, Shakespeare is not simpler. That is, berserk. It also became very clear to me very quickly that actually no one in English departments was actually interested in any of the things that I was interested in because they didn't see literature as a place of stories. And you will just find this. If you go to almost any literature department in the world, none of them have any idea how to tell stories. None of them have any idea how stories work. They're instead interested in interpreting literature to tell you what it means. So they're interested in themes, representations. They have this idea that essentially literature is there to convince you of various deep truths, maybe social truths, maybe philosophical truths, so on and so forth. A lot of times those truths very conveniently happen to align with the truths of the particular professor who is teaching you. So that's kind of their view of the matter. But if you went into your average literature class and said, how do I write a great play? How do I come up with a great character? How do I move tears in my audience? How do I stir laughter in my audience? How do I, create a plot that inspires deep reflection in my audience in the same way that I might feel when I read a Greek tragedy or, I experience Macbeth? How do you do any of those things? No literature professor will have any idea how to do that. That's why no literature professor publishes novels or write plays or does any of those things. So they just don't have any expertise or understanding in these things. And in fact, they read literature in the way I would say is computationally. I mean, they read it the way that AI reads it. It's a series of kind of language elements that you can rearrange. And so, not only did I frustrate them with what they saw as my kind of barbarian approach to literature, they didn't have any of the answers that I was seeking. And so basically, like I think most PhD students can probably identify with this, I basically just spent 5 years teaching myself. And in the end, it worked out.
That's a fantastic journey. Narrative cognition, the central concept underpinning primal intelligence, and I guess your worldview, the role played by intuition, imagination, emotion, and common sense. Can you put a bit more flesh on the bones of narrative cognition for us?
Yeah, so narrative cognition, another word for that would be story thinking. So as opposed to storytelling, it's how your brain is essentially inventing new stories. And as I've already talked about, I think a huge part of human intelligence is the ability to invent new stories. If you can invent a new story, you can be an entrepreneur, you can be an innovator. You can also, of course, be a scientist because you can imagine how is it that the world is working differently than I've been told. And of course, you can also be a great dramatist, a great playwright, all these kinds of things. And so I want to understand, how is it that the brain does this? How does it invent new stories? Where is this coming from? And so I've done a lot of research on this, but the simplest way that to communicate it to people, as I do in the book, is to say, well, basically the way that the brain uses stories is by using these kinds of 4 basic powers. And these powers, I encourage people to think of them as heuristic. There's not literally regions of the brain that do this, but they sort of make it simpler to understand the deep process. And so the first thing with a story is you need to identify an opportunity for a story. Where is there something new? Every good writer, every investigative reporter, every novelist is always looking around for something interesting that sparks a story, that sparks a narrative. And that power is intuition. So the kind of most basic power of your brain in terms of narrative cognition is intuition. Children have a lot of this power. Adults have very little of this power. And that's because children are always fascinated by what's unique, what's special, what's extraordinary about something, whereas adults are conditioned into having this efficiency or productivity psychology where they just want to move as quickly as possible. And so they're usually just dismissing things that they don't understand and saying, oh, that's a waste of my time, regress that to the mean. Just like a computer skips over exceptions or judges them as aberrant, adults are bad at intuition. And so that power, that kind of power that children have of intuition to spot what is unusual and value it, to spot anomalies and lean into them, that's the first part of narrative cognition. The second part, which is imagination, is the ability to take those exceptions to rules and turn them into new stories, turn them into new sequences of action. So once you've seen something that surprises you, to imagine to yourself, where could it go? Where would this kind of unusual thing carry me? And this is the basis, I think, of most effective stories. Most effective stories start with an anomaly, which is known as a hero. The hero is the exception to the rules of their world. And what does the hero do? The hero doubles down on what's unique about themselves. And by doing so, you start to have this plot. And that plot is generated through conflict between the hero and their world, which is to say conflict between the conventional and the unconventional. And so that's the second power, imagination. So when you put together intuition and imagination, what you have is a brain that's able to come up with all these new stories, which is to say all these new plans, all these new different ways that I could act. And when you talk to very creative people, they always have lots of ideas for new businesses. They have lots of ideas for new things they could do with their day. They're always kind of constantly coming up with all these fascinating ideas about what tomorrow could look like. And then, of course, immediately they get totally overwhelmed because they have all these ideas. And which ones do I do? And so you have to then start to decide which of these ideas that you do. And if you were a computer, what you would do is you would apply probability or some other metric. But the way that the human brain does it is it uses these two powers, emotion and common sense. And what common sense does is it matches your plan to your environment. And just very simply, what that means is that if you're in a highly new environment, you need a very new plan. And so in very fast changing environments, there's a premium on creativity and innovation. But in an environment that's fairly predictable or stable, there's very little benefit to that. And so you can kind of go with something that's less innovative. In fact, maybe a very boring plan that you've used a lot before. And so common sense helps you select which plan will kind of work. And what emotion does is emotion helps you select which plan will work for you, because each of us has our own life story. And so we're not just trying to, create these stories out in the world. We're trying to create these stories out in the world in a way that is organic to our own narrative. And your emotions help you do that. There are just certain stories that will feel wrong to you, will feel inauthentic to you, will cause you various forms of kind of negative emotion or so on and so forth. And so being able to understand your own emotions helps you pick the best story that connects with where yourself wants to go. So that's primal intelligence, intuition, imagination, common sense, and emotion. And basically all just comes down to making new plans and then picking the right plan for you in the moment.
I'm particularly taken by your model. I'm particularly taken by your identification that truth often lies in the outliers and the exceptions, or the interesting, the compelling narrative does. One of the in a very, very simple way, when I'm running training in insight and insightful thinking, one of the I mean, it couldn't be older, could it? The Guilford's alternate uses, the 1956. Here's a brick, here's a sneaker, here's a paperclip. Think of as many things as you can. When I've run that with primary school children, I know I'm not alone in this, clearly. When I've run that with primary school children, in a minute they'll come up with 25 different genuinely alternate uses. In a group of corporate executives, they struggle to get beyond 7, and with a brick they'll say a factory, a house, a bungalow. And I said, no, that's not an alternate use. So that rigidity of thinking, that lack of elasticity of thinking, I'm very drawn to your pointing to the way that the children will, as you say, will. I mean, not only come up with new, but come up with new stories that is just kind of squashed out of us. I think often by different elements of education. I know we'll come back and talk more about education. I want to ask you a question about it was something that surprised me because I hadn't thought about it before, and that's the great thing about other people's work and other people's ways of thinking. But in the book, you say a story evolved long before language, and of course, we know story and storytellers and storytelling and maybe story thinking as being constructed or being represented to us and conveyed through language. Could you unpack this thought that story evolved long before language to us a little more?
Yeah. So one thing we know about language is it's not that evolutionarily old. It's maybe 100,000 years old, maybe 1,000,000 years old, but it hasn't been around for that long. And what that means is that if you think that the primary use of story is to communicate, and it's pretty clear that the primary tool for communicating is language, then you end up in this weird paradox, which is that the human brain uses neurons, which are 500 million years old and which think in computational logic. And yet somehow these computational, logic instruments prefer to think in this very evolutionarily new tool. I mean, it's very weird, right? Why would that happen? Why wouldn't it be that human brains, if this is how we think, communicate the way that computers communicate? I mean, a computer doesn't turn all of its information into a story to pass it to the next computer, which then takes a story and then converts it into data. Computers just pass back and forth huge amounts of data. So if the human brain thinks in data, but communicates in story, right, that's weird. So what makes much more sense is that communication is effective in story, or that stories are effective communication because the brain thinks in story. I mean, it just makes a lot more sense that actually the reason that stories work as communication is because for hundreds of millions of years, the brain has been thinking in stories. And when you're told that in the modern world, that seems odd at first, or maybe dangerous. But then when you start to realize, as I've been talking about, that another word for story is a plan, is a plot, it starts to make a lot more sense. And when you start to think about your own cognition, it also starts to make a lot more sense. I mean, when I say to you, Sam, how was your day? You don't say to me 1 0 0 1 2 3, right? You say to me, well, these things happen to me. You tell me a story about it. When we meet for the first time, you tell me a story. When I say to you, hey, what do you want to do this afternoon? You don't give me a spreadsheet. You instead say, hey, how about we do these things? And that's because the human brain thinks naturally in stories. And we know that this is a very evolutionarily old mechanism in the brain because we know that birds are capable of making plans. So if you look at certain kinds of crows, we know that they can make plans because going back to what you were saying about alternate uses with tools, they can come up with alternate uses for sticks and stones. They can use sticks and stones as tools. And so if birds are capable of thinking in plans, and if humans and birds, if our nearest common ancestors go back hundreds of millions of years before the Tyrannosaurus Rex, that tells you that brains were thinking in stories hundreds of millions of years before language evolved, hundreds of millions of years before stories were orally told. And so that's kind of one of the main reasons why I point out in the book that story has to be doing something other than communicating. Sure, it's a great tool for communicating, but it's about something far more profound. And as I suggest, it is for doing what birds do, which is use tools, make plans, and in general, innovate and survive.
I'm compelled by the work. I don't even know the work as a professor of psychology at University of Cambridge called Nikki Clayton, who has done a lot of pioneering work in the area of corvid intelligence and communication among jays, among crows, among magpies, and so on and so forth, and demonstrating quite clearly not only can they kind of make tools, but also that they're able to deceive, that they have theory of mind, that they, when they're hiding 30,000 seeds or bits of meat or whatever, they're doing it, making sure that others aren't watching them. But they're not thinking. They're not thinking in human language or bird language. They're not computing. I completely see your point there about story equal plot and plan.
Yeah. And just to point out, when we talk about theory of mind, what we're really saying is that you have the ability to imagine multiple characters in your brain. And that, it's a form of role playing, in other words. And we know that children start to develop this probably around the age of 4 or so. But it's the ability to imagine that, hey, your mind isn't the same as my mind. And that if your mind isn't the same as my mind, then we have different minds. And that let me imagine what it's like to be in your mind. And let me watch you and see how your mind behaves. And all these kinds of things which are natural in theater games and so on and so forth. And to imagine and to know that birds can do that too, just tells you how ancient this imaginative form of narrative cognition is.
Now, you've become known for your recent proof that computer AI lacks the physical hardware to be able to replicate human creativity. I think that's fair to say that? Yeah, you've said even a sentient, self-aware, and infinitely powerful computer could never innovate or plan to take over the world. If you can fit that into a podcast-sized nutshell, could you tell us why?
Sure. So computers think in equations because that's how logic works. And the human brain thinks in actions. And actions and equations are just totally different physical mechanisms. We know this because whenever logicians, so the whole study of equations and all of computation comes to us from symbolic logic. It's a field that originates with Aristotle over 2,000 years ago. And when logicians try and analyze actions, they always end up immediately with this paradox. And the paradox runs something like this. You've got an action. Well, what is an action? An action is a cause and it's an effect. In other words, it's something that's initiating the action and then the action itself carrying on. Okay, so you've got a cause and an effect. Okay, so logically, the cause and the effect have to take place at the same period of time. Otherwise, they couldn't interact. But also logically, they can't be taking place at the same time because if they were taking place at the same time, they would be the same thing, and one of them, has to precede the other or follow the other. So you start to get into all these just enormous logical puzzles once you start to try and analyze action from the perspective of equations. And what that starts to reveal over time is that logic is a wonderful tool for analyzing certain situations, but it is not the same as reality. Reality is made up of actions. Logic is a tool of taking some of what happens in life and turning it into math equations, which can be useful in certain moments. And so computers, because they're made up entirely of logic gates, can only think in equations. They can't think in actions. As a result, if you say to a computer, Sam runs, the computer will have to take Sam runs and turn that into Sam is running, which you will notice equates Sam with running. And so what that means is that Sam is no longer causing the running. Sam just is the running. And that means that the running just exists eternally, and has no origin. And you see where this starts to happen. And this is why large language models hallucinate, are confused. That's why they're incapable of having world models. All these problems that people have noticed with AI. It's because logic just doesn't understand the world of action. It doesn't understand causation. It only thinks in correlation. And so, the more that your listeners want to go down this rabbit hole, the more that they'll see this to be the case. But the proof of it ultimately is that these LLMs, these large language models, are significantly less intelligent than human children, even though they possess significantly more data. And we're going to see more and more of this divergence. And what that's really telling you is that logic is a really powerful tool for doing certain things, but it is not the equivalent of human intelligence. And if we want to make humans smarter, we actually probably need to spend less time on computers and more time nurturing the parts of our intelligence that are distinct.
Now, you've developed your findings into award-winning training in all sorts of different domains. You said when I asked you how you spent your time, most of your time, apart from with your kids, is with the military training there, and you've had really stellar success with the military, and that's, I'm caricaturing it, but that has historically been, or maybe traditionally been, a sector associated with logic and analysis, and understanding what has happened in the past in order to try and predict what's going to happen in the future. We've been in similar situations like this before. People, when they're cornered, tend to either shoot wildly or bury themselves underground. Tell me, if you would, why is primal intelligence and your approach so strongly resonant for the military?
So the part of the military that I've worked with the most is U.S. Army Special Operations, and they specialize in unconventional warfare. And so one of the real pleasures of working actually with the United States Army is to realize that they're very different than I had thought they were from the outside. From the outside, I thought it was a very logical, kind of programmatic, discipline-driven institution. I would encourage anyone to go out there and study the history of World War II and see, in fact, that the U.S. Army decentralized a lot of its decision-making so that there was a lot of autonomy. There's the encouragements throughout the Army for individuals to have the authority to kind of make their own plans as the situation dictates. And that's because when you're inside the situation, you just have kind of more understanding of what's going on. And that's even more the case with Army Special Operations. Army Special Operations, the whole idea is you're dealing with incredibly new situations. You're basically dropped out of a helicopter. Maybe you're there to rescue a hostage. Maybe you're there to figure out how to open up an underground school for girls in Afghanistan. You're dealing with these incredibly sort of nebulous, fast-moving environments. You've got to be able to think on your feet. And another way of saying think on your feet is you've got to be able to make new plans that work. And so the U.S. Army was fascinated by my theory because I was saying, look, here's how the brain makes new plans that work. And what the U.S. Army had discovered was that over time, there were certain individuals who seemed more effective at coming up with new plans and works that worked than others. So they were basically more Shakespeare's. There were some people who were good at being Shakespeare and other people who weren't. And for a long time, the U.S. Army had just decided, well, you know what? I guess some people are just born Shakespeare. I guess some people are just born with the ability to think faster on their feet, to come up with these new plans. But that's a very undemocratic view of things. And it also did not fit with what the U.S. Army was doing in the early 2000s, which was trying to expand its special operations pipeline. It was basically trying to develop more operators. And so it needed to shift away from just identifying those individuals who were good with coming up with new plans and figure out a way to train up everybody to be able to have new plans. And here I was saying that was possible. And to go back to what we were talking about earlier, the reason I was saying that was possible is because we have been caught in this false dichotomy with the view that intelligence is either computational or magic. So on the side of computation is, logic, data-driven decision-making, all these kinds of things. On the side of magic would be, consciousness, sentience, anything like that. And what I was saying is, no, actually, what computers do is you give them a whole bunch of information, and they pick the pattern that best fits the past. So they're able to select the decision on the table that's most likely to work. Whereas what the human brain does is it invents new solutions. So if you can train up that part of the brain that's able to invent up new solutions and able to do so rapidly and intentionally, then you're able to train up special operators. And so special operations reached out to me. They said, Professor Fletcher, your ideas sound very good theoretically. Do you think they would actually work? I said, I don't know, because I'm a professor. So basically all I do is theory. And they said, well, we'll give you a shot to try them. And so we tried it. It turned out it did work. And it turned out that what it did is it plugged in very nicely to a lot of their existing training, explained why it worked, and then allowed them to expand that training. And then once we expand that training within special operations, we brought it into the conventional Army. They had a lot of success using it there. And then we actually started to take it back into schools for younger students. And we were able to show that when you had this training, you became much more able to make new plans and initiate them and pick the plans that were working, and in general, grow through experience in volatile and uncertain environments, as opposed to do what computers can do, which is sort of maximize probabilities in stable and known environments.
Now, I have for many years called myself a data storyteller. I first studied classics and then I went into behavioral psychology. And I've been today, I'll tell you a short story about today. Today, I've been working with a bunch of corporate executives who work in data heavy environments and find it difficult to move others to action. And I've been talking to them a lot about and giving them kind of ways of working that give them more human, more empathetic ways to use the data in the narratives that they build, that respect the data tolerance of the audience, that take them away from cursive knowledge and so on and so forth. I sense we have a difference on the opinion, a difference of opinion on the importance of data, not least because you say in your book, I love this quote, "To follow the data is to march robotically to doom." I mean, I like to think about balance, but I think I'm right in saying that I mean, from everything that you've said as well, that data is less important than I maintain. Would you agree? And can you tell us why?
So I think data is very, very important when today is the same as yesterday. And there are plenty of environments where that is the case. I mean, inside any warehouse, for example, and there are lots of pockets of stability within almost any economy or any political system or any company. A lot of times what you're doing at a company is, you're trying to scale up a product. And to do that, you sort of have to engage in a kind of repetitive management cycle in which you kind of get everybody on the same page, everybody working the same direction. And so I think in all those kinds of environments, data can be very useful. When I'm talking about marching robotically to doom, what I'm talking about is when you're in any environment that is changing. And the reason I really want to stress that is we're existing in a very volatile era now. And what we know is that the more scared people get in the modern world, the more they tend to try and revert to what worked in the past. And so they're basically trying to say, what's the data? What should I do? And actually, you have to say there is no data on the future. The future is the definition of an unknown unknown. And so the moment that you start to become in an unstable environment, you have to be able to have this high tolerance for initiating new actions and new plans. And so really, the key to intelligence, I think, is combining the two things that you and I do. I think half of intelligence is saying, this is a familiar environment. In a familiar environment, why would I be inefficient? Why would I act like a child? Why would I act, I would instead repeat exactly what worked yesterday. I'm going to scale up things that are working. And that's how a lot of wealth, I think, is generated. And I think that's how a lot of sort of industrial successes occur. As you say, we're going to go ahead and scale this because it's working pretty effectively. But then the moment that stops working, you have to immediately hit the interrupter switch and start to innovate. And I think most people tend to be more comfortable on one side of this or the other, So there's a lot of people that are just comfortable. And when I work with a lot of data folks, they just tend to always think that the answer to the future is always to be found in more numbers, And you really have to shake them out of that belief and say, no, actually, a lot of times the answer to the future is to be found nowhere. And you have to invent it, And then you work with a lot of creatives. A lot of creators are just constantly coming up with new things. And there's no reason to do anything new. Right? Because, there's an off-the-shelf solution that'll work just fine. And so I think you and I are saying very, very, very compatible things. I think it's just that, you're working in an environment where there is that stability and that opportunity to what I would call optimize. And, I'm working in environments where optimization is in fact dangerous because optimization leads to fragility and death.
Yeah, I got it. Absolutely got it. I was at a talk a month or so ago given by a great British madman, advertising man, Sir John Hegarty, now in his early 80s. And he was talking about optimization. He was talking about the importance of creativity. He was talking about the importance of outliers. He was talking about optimization is great for incremental growth, but it's not great for genuinely revolutionary growth. But both of what you're both saying, I think, is absolutely on the money. I'm really interested in innovation, and you say every innovation, no matter how brilliantly revolutionary, initially appears kind of half-formed. You say plans don't spring mature from the womb; they emerge as hints. I was also a few months back at a talk given by the Australian philosopher Peter Godfrey Smith, the author of Other Minds, The Octopus and the Evolution of Intelligent Life. Really interesting that, we have in octopus and squid, we have neurons not in brains, we have them in limbs and so on and so forth. Kind of, the most like non kind of human intelligence on Earth, the most like alien intelligence on Earth, I guess. But his approach to understanding non-human cognition, as he was talking about it, is built up a bit like a kind of pointillist painter by using hints. And you talk about the importance of hints. Can you tell us a bit more about kind of hints and clues and why that's perhaps the key to innovation?
Yeah. So what you are trying to do in innovation is identify the emergence of future opportunities. So you don't want to get too far out ahead. I mean, if you're a highly imaginative person, you can imagine things that might be possible in 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years. But if you really want to be effective in the moment, you want to be catching the leading edge of change. You want to be seeing the first sign that the environment is starting to move in a direction that creates new challenges and new opportunities. And so another word for that is an anomaly, some kind of singularity. And so you want to get very good at detecting, that's a little bit odd. That's something that I haven't seen before. What is the origin of that? And a lot of times anomalies are just noise. So they don't necessarily indicate something, but every big revolution starts as an anomaly. And so you've got to get very good at kind of picking up on those little things and starting to fast play them into the future. And you fast play them in the future by saying, well, what happens if I double down on that or triple down on that? Where's that going? Where's that going? Where's that going? Where's that going? And so that's kind of, the process through which most major innovation happens. Simple classic example, this is, of course, Einstein. What's Einstein? Einstein comes up with theory of relativity. Where does that come from? That comes from he notices what was seen as an anomaly, which is that light apparently moves at a constant speed, regardless of its point of origin. And so physicists had to create this special rule for light known as local time. And so physics for this, period of history in which Einstein was in said, well, light obeys local time, but everything else obeys universal time. And I said, well, actually, what if it was the other way around? What if light is pointing us to the fact that everything obeys local time? And that's relativity. And so you see how he took an anomaly and used it to transform the entire system. And the reason this is important on a practical level, going back to what you were saying before about ideas emerging half-formed, is I can't tell you how many times I've sat in a brainstorming session with folks. And, the best ideas are rejected because they won't work immediately. And, people will come up with all these really clever ideas and they'll say, you know what, and then someone will come up with a very unimaginative idea that could work immediately. And everyone will say, that's perfect. That's an innovation. That's a breakthrough. And what's happening there is that ideas that are actually minor innovations strike the existing system as being major innovations. Whereas the actual breakthrough ideas, because they emerge half-formed, are seen by everyone as deformed, and that there's something wrong with them. And so what will happen in those situations is the half-formed idea, people will cut away all the parts of it that are actually interesting and pull it back towards the mean, rather than doubling down on the parts of it that are unique. And so this is another way of saying is that when you see something really weird, take that as a hint of the future and actually pull away all the parts of it that are familiar and lean into all the parts of it that are strange and see where that gets you. And the more you practice that mental exercise, the more that you will find that you yourself are on the leading edge of innovation.
Fantastic. I actually think we're very much more closely aligned than I was trying to caricature two questions ago. That's very much what I talk about in terms of insight generation. As we say in Britain, Shakespeare has written through your book like a stick of rock. I think through your life like a stick of rock. You also talk and write about some of the greats of Greek literature, from Aristophanes to Sappho. First Shakespeare, then the Greeks. What can we learn from these great storytellers, and how have they shaped your thinking?
So one of the reasons I became fascinated with Shakespeare is because he inspired so many of the people that made the modern world. So if you just look back and you say, who is it that Nikola Tesla was reading? Who is it that Einstein was reading? Who is it that Marie Curie was reading? Who is it that Charles Darwin was reading? Who is it that Vincent van Gogh was reading? And I could go on and on and on with this list, and I've made lists like this in various books, but all these thinkers are reading Shakespeare, and then after reading Shakespeare, they're inventing the future. And so to a certain point, you say, what is happening here? And as I talked about earlier, if you go into a modern literature department, they'll say, well, let's interpret Shakespeare for what he's saying about, the nature of truth or something like that. But actually what's happening in Shakespeare is something that's so much more fundamental, which you see in any child the moment they pick up a storybook, and it's that he's stimulating imagination. He's just making you imagine things. And those things are not things that he has himself literally written on the page. So as a child, when you read a storybook, you start to imagine yourself as the characters doing things that aren't part of the story. Or, you imagine yourself as part of that story world. You say, what would it be like if I went back in time or I entered this sci-fi universe? And you start to have all these kind of powerful imaginative responses where you start creating new behaviors, new plans, new actions, all these things, which, as you've probably picked up, I love. So I was like, how is Shakespeare doing this? This is incredible. And so that is the sort of reason why I am personally obsessed with Shakespeare, because I think that he's a storyteller who inspires you to think of new stories. And that's actually the deepest and most powerful value of story, is to help you imagine new stories. One of the reasons that I'm more broadly interested in story is because I think that because story is the way that the human brain works, stories can help you tune your brain. And this is something which, again, I apologize to anyone who is in a literature department who is listening to this, because every time I say this to my colleagues, they become immediately appalled. But, you can help your brain become more curious by reading certain kinds of stories. You can help your brain process grief and trauma by reading certain kinds of stories. You can help your brain become more creative and more optimistic by reading certain kinds of stories. And, I've gone through my life, and, if anyone's interested, I have a whole bunch of research pointing out exactly what stories to read in those situations. But the overall point is that there's a story out there that can help you tune your brain to get more out of your brain what you want. And, if you go back to the Greeks, a lot of Greek tragedy is written by veterans, for veterans. A lot of it is about processing death and grief. And we can learn a lot from Greek tragedy about how to process grief. And, the case of Sappho, what's amazing about Sappho is that you read her poems now and you still fall in love. You still fall in love with Sappho. You discover this sense of just a close emotional connection to another human being. And she invented this form of narrative writing, which involves a lot of personal disclosure, taking risks, telling dangerous secrets. And you see that now in a lot of, I would say, effective stories where storytellers figure out how to make themselves vulnerable in certain ways to create a connection with the audience. And so all of these are these incredible techniques, technologies that are developed by these earlier writers. And when they're understood by modern writers, they can, of course, be used to create new stories. But I think more fundamentally, they can be used to improve our own lives and our own relationships, helping us understand that if we're having a problem in our relationship, we might want to act more like Sappho. And instead of getting aggressive with the other person and telling them all the things that they're doing wrong, instead look inwardly and say, where are there places where I can start to share things that are a little bit frightening for me, and see how this other person responds when I do that. And if they start to respond by themselves disclosing things that are hard for them to disclose, then we can start to deepen our relationship. And so to me, literature is just this amazing resource going all the way back to the Greeks for living a better life, for having ethics in the true and profound sense of ethics, which is not, moral right and wrong and judging other people and telling them how they're misbehaving and so on and so forth, but instead having a more flourishing life.
Storytelling is the way that we navigate, make sense of the world, and develop our own new, as you say, our own new plans, our own new stories. One of the things that I was struck by in your book is when you describe education in the classroom as a miseducation for life. Particularly given that kind of learning long lists of facts is completely redundant now. How do you think school should be restructured, independent of subject matter or courses, to make it more world-focused, more student-focused?
So the main problem with school now is it's basically set up to teach you one thing. And that one thing that it's set up to teach you is that there's an answer and the teacher has it. I mean, that's basically the main thing that you learn in school. You go into school and you're like, okay, there's a right answer. And, there's an authority figure, a parent who knows it. That messes you up for life for so many different reasons. First of all, most of the time in life, there isn't an answer. I mean, there actually isn't an answer and you got to find it, or maybe there's multiple possible answers. I mean, life is pretty open-ended. And, in those cases where there actually is an answer, it's very rare that the teacher has it. If the teacher had it, they probably wouldn't be teaching in school. They'd probably be out there, inventing rocket ships or what have you. So school creates this entire problem. We know that the more that the kids believe in right answers, the less they believe in new answers. So the less likely they are to activate their creativity, the less likely they are to, activate their autonomy, their initiative, all these kinds of things. That leads them to problems with self-efficacy, problems with resilience. It leads them to a dependency. It leads them to the belief that there is an answer out there somewhere. So if my teacher doesn't have it, if I don't know, then I should go on the internet, then I should ask AI. And you start to get this whole dependency cycle. And so really what we want to do is we want to create classroom environments that are filled with complex, open-ended problems that the teacher does not have the answer to. And I can already tell, from the basis, from the way that you're describing the way that you work with companies, that's probably what you do in a workshop environment is you show up and you're like, there just isn't an answer to this problem, but there's lots of possible answers, and I myself don't know the answer, but we're going to engage in a kind of process of discovery and I'm going to reveal my expertise by showing you how I navigate uncertainty and how I come up with new ideas and then how I test them and then how I make plans to test them further outside this classroom, because no idea, no matter how well tested it can be in a classroom, can never be fully tested in a classroom. You've actually got to put it into real life. And so a lot of what we do in classrooms is we're, first of all, encourage students to bring in their own problems. The way that school works now, you come in as a student and you're given a set of problems by the teacher. And that's not only just distinct from your life, but that shifts authority onto the teacher. And the teacher then has, the power to say whether it's right or wrong. No, you as the student come in and say, what problems do you want to solve? And whenever we do this, it initially creates terror in teachers because, of course, a lot of times students will come in and they'll say things like, well, my problem is that my parents are arguing and I'm concerned they're going to get divorced, and then the teacher will be like, oh my goodness, like that's not a problem I know how to answer. But we say, but you know what? That's the most important problem in the student's life right now. So let's have them talk through what's something that they could try to do the next time their parents argue, what's something that they could do, and then the more we start to get students talking about these problems in their real life that they can then test themselves, the more they start to develop confidence in their own powers of creativity and common sense. And then the more they start to go beyond their own lives to start exploring other people's lives and helping other people solve problems and starting to think about science and technology and art and history and all these other areas. But you get that initial buy-in by working with students. So the first thing that we do is that we bring in these open-ended problems. And then, at a kind of like higher level, I've been asked to essentially take over a part of the training of our business undergraduates here at Ohio State University. So here in America, we have business is an undergraduate field of expertise, which is becoming increasingly popular. And the idea is that you can somehow train in school to become an entrepreneur or run your own company. And so what we've done is we've taken the same training we do in special operations and we brought that into these undergraduate classrooms. And the way that we do that is we say to the student, okay, give us your business plan. And the students give us this business plan. And then we say to them, that's a great plan. On day one, here's something that goes wrong. What do you do in response? And then they have to come up with an answer. And we say, that's a great answer. Now, here's what happened. Here's what went wrong again. And we keep pushing them down this road. And the reason we're pushing them down this road is to help them identify where they're struggling. And typically students will struggle in one of four areas, which I'll just give you very quickly, are failure of initiative, failure of emotional confidence, failure of imagination, and failure of strategic vision. And that basically means that students are either struggling to come up with a plan in the first place, or when they come up with a plan, they're struggling to have the confidence to do it. Or if they can come up with a plan, they think that's the only plan and it's the right way and they keep trying to force it, even though the situation is changing or it's not working. Or finally, the fourth one, failure of strategic vision, they can come up with a lot of different plans, but they have no overall goal. And so as a result, they're just kind of turning in circles. And so by creating this classroom environment where students can start to understand, here are my strengths, but also weaknesses in terms of making plans, we're starting to help them understand when they go out in the real world, here's how I can start to identify when I'm having a problem myself as a leader, as a business person. And then we start to give them a lot of techniques and tools for training themselves out of this problem. So that gives you a little bit of a sense, but basically the big picture is take some more of the real world, put it in the classroom, and, decenter the teacher as the authority and instead make life experience the authority so that you're always, as a student, testing yourself against reality.
But that's very much about the plots and the plans that we build, the stories that we tell about the businesses that we're looking to create. And I sense that those four areas map very nicely onto the four areas of narrative cognition too. Now, brilliant. So, just before we draw to a close, just want to go back. You've mentioned this a couple of times, but just thinking about when you believe it is and it isn't smart to use data to guide decision making. You've talked about both stability and kind of volatile uncertainty, when there's a lot of information, when there's little information. Could you just summarize when you think it is and isn't smart to use data to guide decision making?
So it's smart to use data when you've got a lot of reliable data. And when you've got a lot of reliable data, what that's telling you is that you're in a transparent and stable environment. So you can see pretty clearly everything, and it hasn't changed that much. And that's another way of saying that you're living in math. In math, things don't change, And as we've talked about, there are plenty of human environments which for periods of time essentially become mathematical. And that's great. And you want to use that opportunity to optimize, to increase productivity. And typically, in the case of businesses, those will happen in the periods after an innovation. So what will happen is you will come up with an innovation, like the iPhone, for example, or some new cancer drug, and you will have beaten your competitors to it. And as a result, you're on the front foot, you're pushing the environments. And so you can start to scale rapidly without any competitors coming in and disrupting what you've laid out. And so that's a great time to use data. The problem is that most companies turn to data when they're struggling. So what'll happen is, their sales will start to lag or fall off, or, they'll see a loss of effectiveness, or a new competitor will come into the space, or there'll be some new regulations that will be disrupting them. And so there'll be change. And then they'll say, you know what, the way we have to respond to this change is by gathering a lot of data and telling us what to do. And no amount of data in that situation is going to be able to tell you what to do. What you have to do in that situation is start to use your initiative and your imagination to come up with pilot programs that you then test, develop over time. The more your company is struggling, the more you have to push your appetite for risk. And what that means is that you should never, ever, ever hire consultants, ever. Because consultants are people that you bring in at these moments of maximum risk, and they just give you an answer off the shelf, basically. I mean, that's why they're effective as consultants. I mean, it's a great job to have as your consultant, but, you have to understand that, the more you're in a state of doubt, the more you have to do something new, the more you have to do something that other people haven't done. And if you don't have the confidence in yourself to do that, you have to pick a new leader for your organization, because there is someone out there that has that capacity and that vision. I was doing a thing with NASA recently. This project ended up getting defunded, but it's an interesting story, I think, to give companies an idea about how they can develop this. And what NASA noticed is that they were bringing in all these really young, talented engineers in their early 20s. And these young, talented engineers would make no contributions to major projects until they were in their late 20s or early 30s, because the system was basically suppressing all of these kinds of young minds. And by the time these young, brilliant engineers started making contributions, they'd been in the system for so long that they were actually kind of thinking like the system already, and their ideas weren't really that new anymore, And so NASA said, this is kind of a problem, that actually we're bringing in all these leaders and visionaries and innovators, but our system structure is kind of suppressing them. Like, what do we do? And so the idea that we had was we would build this little kind of onboarding system where these young folks would be developed, would be nurtured, and then would be paired with a senior mentor. And that would empower them to introduce their ideas faster into the system. And that way, when NASA started struggling or encountering rough waters that they hadn't seen before, they had this huge reserve of new and fresh ideas that weren't part of kind of core NASA, but were nevertheless close enough to what NASA was doing that they could be useful. And so this is another way of saying that your job as an organization isn't just to be existing in the present, it's to be existing in the future. And one way that you exist in the future is you bring in young talent and encourage what is anomalous about it, what is distinct about it, what is different about those young people than what you yourself are currently thinking. And that way, when you run out of ideas and are thinking about picking up the phone and calling a consultant, instead you turn inward to the young folks on your bench and you give them the chance to try something. And those are the corporations that tend to be really, really, really successful. And those are the corporations we're seeing less of than ever in the modern world, because we are training so many of our young people to think computationally instead of encouraging what is distinct and unique about their ideas.
Brilliant. That draws things together absolutely beautifully. Thank you so much. And finally, where can our viewers and our listeners find out more about you and your work and Project Narrative online in social media and so on?
Well, I don't really do social media, but I think, the only Angus in Ohio. So if you just Google Angus in Ohio, that'll get you to most stuff. And of course, I have this book, Primal Intelligence, that just became a national bestseller here in the United States. And so I would encourage people to read that. It's probably a faster way of getting to understand my ideas than trying to scroll through my various faculty pages.
It's a tremendous book. Thank you so much for your time today, Angus. If only there were more people with your approach to narrative and storytelling, there would be rather less malarkey in the world of human decision-making and rather more stories driven by common sense. Angus Fletcher from Project Narrative, Ohio State University. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sam.